Imagine inheriting the empire your father built through sheer hard work, yet having no idea who to trust. Julia, an unexpected heiress, decided to go undercover as a cleaner to uncover the truth about her own company. What she overheard in the shadows would change her life forever. Get ready for a story of betrayal, secrets, and a showdown that will reveal who truly deserves to be in control. Stick around until the end to see how a simple cleaning can expose what's hidden within the walls of a powerful corporation. Julia sat in the vast hall, surrounded by luxurious furniture that, in that moment, felt like it was closing in on her. The heavy curtains blocked out the natural light, plunging the room into a dimness that matched the whirlwind of emotions she was feeling. The lawyer, a serious-looking middle-aged man, read her father's will in a low, methodical voice, but to Julia, every word felt like a blow, an inevitable sentence. "Julia, my daughter, I entrust you with the leadership of the company I built throughout my life. I know that, despite your fears, you will be able to steer this empire into a future that will honor our name." Those words echoed in her mind. The room seemed to shrink, and for a moment the air grew too heavy to breathe. How could he be so certain? She'd never been directly involved in the business. She had always admired from a distance, watching Sir Bernard's fearless and calculated way of doing things. But now it was all in her hands. It felt like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. A flash of memory crossed her mind, taking her back to a simpler time. She was just a little girl, her hair blowing in the wind, running through the mansion's garden. Her father stood tall and imposing, watching her with a fatherly smile. "One day, Julia," he had said, "you'll understand what it means to carry a legacy. And when that day comes, I want you to remember one thing. The strength of a leader lies in the courage to face the unknown." She'd always known he saw something in her, a quality she herself doubted she possessed. But now, sitting there, hearing the future he had planned for her, Julia felt the ground slipping away beneath her feet. The reading room, with its walls lined with shelves full of rare books, was imposing, but the silence in there was almost tangible. The tension in the air weighed on Julia in a way she had never felt before. The lawyer kept reading, but she could barely pay attention. Her mind was stuck on the last conversation she'd had with her father. He had been ill, his body weakened by time, but his eyes still had that determined sparkle. "I trust you, Julia, more than anyone else. You have the vision and the strength needed to continue what I started. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." At the time, she had tried to protest, to say she wasn't the right person for such a burden, but he'd interrupted her with a gentle gesture. "I know what I'm doing," he'd said with a soft smile, as if he had been preparing her for that moment for a long time. Now that smile seemed like a distant memory, almost out of reach. The lawyer paused for a moment, looking at her with a neutral expression, but Julia knew he could sense the turmoil inside her. Taking a deep breath, she refocused on the words coming from his mouth. "Sir Bernard stated that the company should be entrusted to you immediately, with no intermediaries. You will be solely responsible for all strategic decisions from now on. He believed this was the only way to keep the family's legacy intact." The word responsible screamed in her mind. What would become of her now? It wasn't just the inheritance of a multi-million-pound company. It was her father's trust, the legacy he had spent his entire life building, and that had now suddenly become her burden. She glanced around, her eyes resting on the family photos adorning the walls. In one of them, Sir Bernard smiled proudly beside his young daughter, not knowing that fate would so quickly put them on separate paths. There was so much expectation in that image, so much love, and now, so much weight. As much as her father had believed in her, Julia couldn't quiet the doubt that consumed her. She knew that, behind the walls of that immense company, there were people waiting for her to fail. People who would underestimate her and, like snakes in the grass, were ready to snatch everything from her hands. The future seemed like a treacherous trap. "I can't let him down," she thought, as her heart pounded in her chest. fighting the vulnerability that threatened to show on her face. When the lawyer finished reading, Julia remained silent. Her father's final words, recorded in that will, echoed in her mind. He believed in her. But did she believe in herself? Looking out of the window of the grand mansion, she realized that this was her crossroads. It would be easy to let fear take over, to run from her responsibilities and let others take control. But something inside her, a spark her father had always seen, began to stir. She couldn't let him down. Not now. Not after everything. With one last glance at the portrait of Sir Bernard, Julia made a decision. She wouldn't let doubt define her. Even if she was terrified, she would face the battle ahead. She would honor her father's name. The silence in the room seemed to swallow everything around it. Julia stood up slowly, feeling the invisible weight of expectations on her shoulders. The lawyer's eyes followed her, respectful but inquisitive, as though he was curious to see how she would respond. But Julia said nothing. She simply took a deep breath and walked towards the window, gazing out at the vast garden that once brought her peace. Now, it felt like just another extension of her responsibility. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting golden and reddish hues across the horizon. That view had always been a refuge for her, a way to escape reality. But today, it was different. Today, there was no escape. Her father was gone, and the life she knew had changed forever. She was no longer just Sir Bernard's daughter. She was the heiress, the leader, the pillar holding up the structure he had built. But deep down, there was a corrosive doubt. Did she really know the company? Could she handle the challenges ahead? Or worse, did she even know the people now under her command? She knew many employees had been loyal to her father, but to her, that was a different matter altogether. Julia closed her eyes, allowing the memory of her last visit to the office to surface in her mind. It had been just before her father had become gravely ill. At the time, she had only observed from a distance, like a stranger in her own kingdom. The whispers in the corridors, the closed-door meetings, the hurried conversations that stopped when she walked into a room. There was something more going on, something her father had seemed reluctant to tell her. Something dark that lingered in those halls. She thought back to one of the last pieces of advice her father had given her. Never trust blindly, Julia. Loyalty in business is something that has to be earned every day. A chill ran down her spine. Her father had always been a strong man, and she had looked up to him, learning from a distance. But now, he wasn't there to guide her anymore. She was on her own. With that thought, a wave of fear swept over her. Not fear for herself, but fear of failing everything her father had built. She knew that his absence would be felt by everyone, and the vulnerability she carried, without her father's protective shield, would be clear to those ready to exploit it. Another flashback hit her. It was a summer afternoon, and she stood beside her father in the company's boardroom. He had brought her to witness some important decisions, insisting that one day she would understand why. Back then, Julia didn't give it much thought, preferring to imagine herself anywhere but in that rigid environment. In that room, her father seemed like a giant. He spoke little, but every word carried the weight of a decree. Even the most powerful executives listened to him with reverence. "You'll never have to raise your voice to be heard if your actions speak for you," he'd said that afternoon. At the time, she hadn't understood what he meant, but now, sitting in that same room, alone, the words echoed like a warning. The company wasn't just a business machine. It was a nest of snakes disguised as allies. And she, ill-prepared and hesitant, would have to navigate that minefield. Still standing by the window, her heart racing, Julia began to realize that if she wanted to honor her father's legacy, she'd have to do more than sit in the director's chair. She'd need to see the company from the inside up close, from a place where no one would expect her to be. "I can't fail you, Dad," she whispered, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. But a new sense of determination was beginning to grow inside her. It was then, in the heavy silence of the room, that a daring idea began to take shape in her mind. Maybe Maybe the only way to understand who her true allies and enemies were was to observe everything from a different perspective. Not as Sir Bernard's daughter, but as someone invisible. Someone no one would notice. Later that night, back at home, sitting in her bedroom with a glass of wine in hand, Julia stared at the idea forming in her mind with more clarity. Her faithful housekeeper, Lavinia, entered quietly, carrying some documents that needed signing. Lavinia had known her since she was a child. She was more than a servant, she was like a second mother. Julia had always trusted her, and now she felt she needed that trust more than ever. "Lavinia, I've been thinking about something," Julia began, hesitant but determined. "I need to see the company for what it really is. I need to find out who's on my side and who's plotting against me." Lavinia looked at her, intrigued. "And how do you plan to do that, dear?" Julia set her glass down on the table and lifted her eyes, locking them onto Lavinia's curious expression. "I'm gonna go undercover. I'll enter the company as a cleaner. Someone nobody notices, but who sees and hears everything." For a brief moment, Lavinia's face showed surprise, but it quickly turned into a wise smile. "That's exactly the sort of thing your father would do, something unexpected and clever." She stepped closer, gently placing a hand on Julia's shoulder. "I can help you with this. I know how the cleaning staff works there, and trust me, they never pay attention to who's behind the uniform." Julia smiled, feeling a new strength rise within her. It was a bold, risky decision, but a necessary one. If she wanted to save her father's legacy and uncover the truth about those around her, she would have to blend into the shadows, watching from a place where no one would suspect her presence. And there, in the quiet of the night, Julia prepared for the most challenging role of her life, becoming invisible in her own empire. In the days that followed, Julia's life began to change in ways she'd never imagined. The heiress of a multi-million-pound company was about to swap her elegant suits for a simple, modest uniform that would pass unnoticed by all. It was as if she were shedding the identity she'd always known to become someone else entirely. The decision she had made was radical, but there was no other option. She needed to understand the dynamics operating in the shadows, and the only way was to become invisible. Lavinia, as always, proved to be a loyal and practical ally. She knew the inner workings of Sir Bernard's company like no one else. Having worked there as a cleaner long before becoming the Bernard family's housekeeper, her insights would be essential to ensuring Julia wasn't recognized. That morning, Lavinia brought the uniform with her. It was simple, a faded gray with a white apron over the top. The rough fabric contrasted sharply with Julia's usual fine clothing, but that was exactly what she needed. Detachment. Infiltration. "It's the perfect disguise," Lavinia had said with a half smile, though the older woman's eyes held a trace of hidden concern. Julia stood, staring at her reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the woman she saw. Her hair, usually styled meticulously, was now tied back in a simple bun. Her face, free from makeup, revealed softer, more vulnerable features. In the cleaner's uniform, she looked like someone else, someone closer to the raw reality of the world outside mansions and boardroom meetings. "Are you sure about this?" Lavinia asked, breaking the heavy silence in the room. "Once you step into that role, it won't be easy to turn back. They'll treat you like anyone else in that position." Julia nodded, a chill running down her spine. That's exactly what she wanted. To be treated like any other cleaner. To overhear the conversations around her, to witness the masks fall in the presence of someone the powerful deemed irrelevant. This company was hers now, and she would do whatever it took to protect it, even if it meant hiding in the shadows to uncover the truth. Taking one final deep breath, she turned to Lavinia. "I'm ready." Julia's first day as an employee at Bernard Corp was a shock to the system. Entering through the back of the imposing building where the lower-level staff passed, she realized the magnitude of her new role. The cold, impersonal corridors were far removed from the luxury of the boardrooms or the glass offices she used to visit. Here, she was just another worker, invisible to the eyes of others. The difference in treatment was stark. When she entered the break room for the cleaning staff, she was greeted with brief, uninterested glances. No greetings, no recognition. To them, Julia was just another newcomer, and that comforted her in a way. Her disguise was working, her plan was starting to unfold. Throughout the day, she was assigned to clean various common areas of the company: the corridors, the staff cafeteria, and a few meeting rooms. As she scrubbed the floors, she caught fragments of conversations around her. Voices that would have fallen silent in her presence now spoke freely, unaware that the woman on her knees with a bucket and broom was the new owner of it all. But it was in the executive corridors where Julia's true focus lay. It was there, between the offices of the top brass, that corporate intrigue played out, where the real power resided. And within those walls, she began to notice one name repeatedly cropping up in conversations: Nicholas. Nicholas, the financial manager, was a well-respected figure within Bernard Corp, someone many trusted implicitly. His charisma and skill with numbers had earned him a position of prominence, and he always seemed to be at the center of the most important decisions. But there was something about him that unsettled Julia, something that now, listening to conversations behind half-open doors, started to make sense. There was a tone of conspiracy, of secrets shared with those willing to betray. One quiet afternoon, while scrubbing the floor near the boardroom, Julia heard the muffled sound of voices. She paused for a moment, her heart racing, and edged closer to the slightly open door. Inside, Nicholas and another executive were discussing the sale of a part of the company that, as far as she knew, had never been mentioned in any official meetings. It was a dirty deal, a diversion of resources that would undoubtedly harm the empire her father had built. Her stomach churned. She kept listening, her hands trembling as they gripped the mop. Nicholas's words were like poison. "She hasn't a clue what's going on. The new director's just a puppet. We'll make our move before she even realizes." Anger began to bubble up inside Julia, mixed with the sting of betrayal. Her father had trusted this man, and now he was plotting to tear down everything Sir Bernard had created. Worse still, he was manipulating Melina, her daughter. Julia could barely process the words coming out of Nicholas's mouth. He was using Melina, exploiting her naivety to gain an advantage within the company. Julia's blood ran cold. Melina, her own daughter, was being drawn into a web of lies, completely unaware. This wasn't just a financial conspiracy, it was a personal betrayal. She backed away from the door, trying to stay calm, but her heart was on fire. She couldn't act impulsively. Not yet. She needed more evidence, more proof to bring Nicholas down and expose his corruption. In the following weeks, Julia carefully watched Nicholas's every move, every document he signed, every meeting he held behind closed doors. And with each new detail, the certainty of his betrayal grew stronger. She was ready. She knew what she had to do. However, the emotional weight of protecting her daughter made it all the more complicated. She knew Melina trusted Nicholas completely, and confronting this truth would break her heart. But Julia was resolute. She would protect her daughter, save the company, and honor her father's legacy, no matter the cost. All that was left now was the final confrontation. The moment when Julia, stripped of her disguise, would face Nicholas head-on and reveal the truth to everyone. The tension in the air was palpable, and for the first time since hearing the will, Julia felt she was truly in control. The following weeks tested Julia's endurance like never before. Between eavesdropping on conversations and gathering evidence, she lived through tense days, sleepless nights, and the constant fear of being discovered. But at the same time, something inside her began to shift. The weight of responsibility that had once suffocated her was now shaping her. Slowly, Julia felt stronger, more certain of what needed to be done. She was no longer the uncertain woman, crushed by the expectations of her father's will. Now, she had a plan, and she was prepared to face the consequences, no matter how painful they might be. That afternoon, as she carefully organized the documents she had managed to collect, her heart raced. Photos of suspicious transactions, recordings of conversations, emails exchanged between Nicholas and other executives. Everything she needed to expose him. The plan was in motion. Lavinia had helped her every step of the way, her only confidant. The old housekeeper, always wise and calm, watched Julia's transformation with a mix of pride and concern. "You've become a brave woman, Julia," Lavinia had said one night, as Julia pored over the last of the documents. "But remember, when you unmask one viper, you stir up the others hiding in the nest." Julia knew Lavinia was right. Exposing Nicholas wouldn't be the end. It would be the beginning of a new battle. But this time, she was ready. The big day arrived. Julia spent the morning in a tense but determined silence. The cleaner's uniform had been carefully tucked away, and in its place she wore a tailored suit, something worthy of a director. It was time to reclaim her place, but now with the knowledge of who was loyal and who had betrayed her. The board meeting was scheduled for early afternoon, and the main conference room was already being prepared. Executives moved through the corridors, some in a hurry, others more relaxed, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Among them, Nicholas walked with his usual confidence, greeting colleagues and maintaining his facade as the charismatic, trustworthy manager. But Julia knew the truth behind that smile. When she entered the room, all eyes turned to her. There was a shift in her posture, in her gaze. This wasn't the hesitant Julia who had inherited the company with a fear of failure. This was a woman determined, ready to face whatever came her way. Nicholas was there, seated at the table, wearing a cordial expression. He greeted her with the same friendly tone as always, but Julia noticed something different, a flicker of doubt, perhaps a suspicion that she knew more than she had let on. He was about to find out the truth. When the meeting began, Julia remained calm, watching each of the executives, feeling the weight of the moment. After a few minutes of formalities, she slowly rose to her feet, drawing everyone's attention. Silence fell over the room. "Today, we have a different agenda," she said, her voice steady but laced with restrained emotion. "A few weeks ago, I started investigating certain irregularities within the company. I discovered that there is a network of betrayals and diversions that threaten everything my father built." There was a murmur of surprise among those present, but Nicholas remained still, his eyes fixed on Julia. He knew this was about him, but he kept his mask impassive, for now. "And unfortunately," Julia continued, her tone growing colder, "the person responsible is sitting in this very room." The air seemed to freeze. Shock was visible on the faces around the table, but Julia didn't waver. "Nicholas," she said at last, letting the name escape with calculated calm. "You betrayed my father's trust, my trust, and tried to use my daughter to further your own ambitions." Nicholas's eyes finally betrayed what he'd been trying to hide. The confident facade began to crack, and the silence that followed felt endless. "These are serious accusations, Julia," Nicholas replied, his voice tense. "Do you really think you can accuse me without evidence? Everyone here knows my dedication to Bernard Corp." Julia stared back at him, unblinking. "I wouldn't make accusations without proof, Nicholas." And with a simple gesture, she placed a folder of documents on the table. Photos of fraudulent emails, suspicious bank transfers, and a series of recordings she had gathered over the weeks. She spread them out across the table, under the watchful and disbelieving eyes of the other directors. Nicholas tried to maintain his composure, but panic began to flicker in his eyes. He glanced quickly around, as if searching for invisible support, but the other executives were in shock. The betrayal was clear, and whispers began to ripple through the room. "You manipulated my daughter, Nicholas," Julia continued, feeling the anger and disgust spill over. "You made her believe you were her ally, when all you wanted was to use her for your selfish plans. This ends here, today." Nicholas tried to rise from his seat, the tension etched on his face. "I don't know what you're talking about. This is a setup." But Julia remained unfazed. She knew this moment was crucial, and she was prepared for the storm that would follow. "You can deny it all you like, Nicholas, but the evidence is right here. The board has seen everything. There's nowhere left to run. It's over. The sound of the door opening abruptly interrupted the confrontation. Milena, Julia's daughter, entered the room. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with tears, but there was a newfound strength in her expression. She looked directly at Nicholas, and in her voice was a mix of pain and barely contained fury. "I heard everything, Nicholas," Milena said, her voice trembling but firm. "You manipulated me, and I trusted you." The silence in the room grew even heavier, as if the air had been sucked out in an instant. Nicholas looked at Milena, but there was nothing left to say. He was exposed, and everyone there knew it. Julia walked over to Milena, gently placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. The moment wasn't just about Nicholas's betrayal, but about the broken trust between mother and daughter. Yet, in that instant, a bridge began to rebuild. Milena, though wounded, stood by Julia's side, ready to face the truth. "This ends today, Nicholas," Julia repeated, her voice firm and final. "You're out of Bernard Corp." The executives around the table slowly nodded, as if waking from a nightmare. Nicholas at last accepted his defeat. He rose, anger flashing in his eyes, but said nothing more. In silence, he left the room, leaving behind the empire he had tried to destroy. As the door closed, Julia felt the weight of the world lift from her shoulders. She looked at Milena, who gazed back at her with tears in her eyes, and embraced her, finally allowing the built-up tension to melt away. "Forgive me, Mum," Milena whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't know." Julia stroked her daughter's hair with a tenderness she hadn't shown in a long time. "It's all right, love. Now we know who's really with us, and from today, we'll rebuild this together." Sir Bernard's legacy was safe, but more importantly, the family was united again. Julia took a deep breath, letting the silence of the boardroom fill every corner as Nicholas walked out, defeated. The eyes of the board were on her, waiting for the next move. But in that moment, she felt entirely in control. Something that had seemed unimaginable just a few months ago. Her father's legacy was secure, but her journey as a leader, as the rightful heir to Sir Bernard, was only just beginning. Milena was still by her side, her face streaked with tears and the pain of betrayal. Julia looked at her daughter, feeling the weight of all that had happened. Everything she'd done in the past weeks, all the risky decisions, had been to protect the company, the family name, but also to protect Milena. And now, seeing her daughter so fragile, she knew she needed to take a step towards rebuilding the trust between them. "I believed everything, Mom," Milena whispered, her voice trembling with hurt and shame. She could barely look at her. "I thought he really supported me, but he was just using me." The pain in Milena's voice struck Julia like a blow. Her daughter, so innocent and trusting, had been cruelly manipulated. Julia's protective instinct kicked in, and she moved closer, gently touching her daughter's face, making her look into her eyes. "We all fall into traps sometimes, Milena," Julia said, her tone firm but full of love. "I've been fooled too, trusted the wrong people. But what matters now is that you know the truth. What's important is that you've learned who to trust. We'll get through this, together." Milena sobbed quietly and let herself be held by her mother, a hug full of pain but also relief. Though Nicholas's betrayal had wounded her, the emotional reconnection with her mother brought a new kind of comfort. Julia felt stronger knowing her daughter was by her side, finally understanding how much they needed each other. When the embrace ended, Julia turned again to the boardroom table. The room was still thick with silence, the executives watching the personal drama unfold with a mixture of respect and anticipation. She knew now was the time to establish her role as a leader. This wasn't just about removing Nicholas. It was about making it clear that she would be a very different kind of director than they expected. With a firm and steady voice, Julia straightened her shoulders and spoke. "From today, Bernard Corp will enter a new era. I will ensure this company runs with the integrity my father always wanted. That starts now. Every decision will be reviewed, every person evaluated, and any misplaced loyalties will have no place here." The intensity of her voice filled the room. Each executive seemed to understand that things were about to change, and change dramatically. This wasn't an empty promise, but a strategic plan for reorganization. Julia wasn't just going to take her father's throne. She was going to lead with a new kind of strength, one born from her vulnerability, now transformed into courage. I know there have been questionable loyalties, she continued, looking directly at the executives. But I also know there are people here who honor Sir Bernard's legacy. And to those people, I offer my complete trust. We will rebuild this together. But make no mistake, there will be no more room for power games or betrayals. The company my father built will not be destroyed from within. She watched the reactions around her. Some looked nervous, others surprised, but most had expressions of relief. The shadow of Nicholas still lingered in the room, but everyone knew Bernard Corp needed new leadership, and Julia was ready to take on that role, with a firm hand and sharp eyes. We're entering a new era, Julia repeated, with calm confidence, and I'll make sure this time we don't fail. The silence was broken by murmurs of agreement, and Julia realized that, for the first time, the board looked at her with genuine respect. She was no longer the hesitant heiress, overwhelmed by the weight of her father's will. She was a leader in the making, someone who had faced her fears, uncovered betrayal where she least expected, and yet rose stronger than before. As the meeting drew to a close, the executives began to disperse, some casting quick glances at Julia, but this time with a mixture of reverence and acceptance. Lavinia, watching discreetly from the door, smiled with pride. Julia's transformation, which had begun with her disguise as a cleaner, was now complete. When the room finally emptied, Julia turned to Melina, who was still watching her in silence. There was so much left to say, so much to rebuild between them, but they knew they were on the right path. Julia reached out her hand and, with a gentle smile, asked, "Shall we start this together?" Melina smiled back, her eyes still wet but clearer than before. "Yes, Mum, together." And in that moment of reconciliation and renewal, Julia knew her father's legacy was safe. Not just because she had exposed Nicholas's betrayal, but because she had learned to lead with heart, with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. As she walked through the corridors of Bernard Corp beside Melina, she felt a new energy in every step. The future was still uncertain, and challenges would surely come, but for the first time since her father's death, Julia felt truly ready. Not just to protect the empire, but to create something new, something she and her daughter could build together. The company was entering a new era, and Julia was at the helm, stronger than ever. Julia faced the weight of a legacy, the fear of failure, and the betrayal of those who were meant to be her allies. To protect her father's empire, she had to become invisible, while at the same time discovering a strength she never imagined. Disguised as a cleaner, she unearthed hidden truths that threatened her father's company, and most importantly, shielded her daughter from being used in a cruel power game. In the end, Julia didn't just expose Nicholas's treachery, she found within herself the strength to lead Bernard Corp. Sir Bernard's legacy is safe, not only in the hands of his daughter, but in the new vision she's beginning to build into something even greater. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Julia's shoes? And make sure to check out the latest video. Remember, the power of truth can change everything.